15th General Assembly. I want to take this opportunity to welcome you all to the second day of the Assembly. As you've already figured out from the program, we are going to have this morning the Cheikh Anta Diop lecture, which will be delivered by His Excellency, former President of South Africa, Thabo Mbeki. The session will be chaired by Professor Adebayo Olukoshi, and I do not know if I need to introduce Professor Olukoshi, popularly known as Bayo. He is a former Executive Secretary of CODESRIA. He is the Regional Director at the moment of International IDEA Africa Office, and we are glad that he accepted our invitation to chair this session. And without wasting your time, I would like to ask Bayo to take the stage.
Thank you very much indeed, Godwin. Your Excellency, President Thabo Mbeki. In West Africa, once you have been a prime minister, minister, or president, you keep that title for life. So I'm not even going to say ex-president. You may not keep the office for life, but you keep the title for life. So, Your Excellency President Thabo Mbeki, President, members of the Executive Committee of CODESRIA, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I was given an official biographical note to read on you, Mr. President. I looked at it. I felt it was too dry. I always like to tell a story around personalities like you, people who have had a great impact on our lives as Africans and on the journey which we have traveled in the struggle for liberation. And in your particular case, Mr. Mbeki, there's something which is, I think, unique about your presence here today. I was asking Jimmy, Adeshina, and later on Tandika yesterday, and it was actually in 1993, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of CODESRIA, that your father, Governor Mbeki, was actually welcomed by this council and honored with the first ever award of a distinguished fellow of CODESRIA. You are here today as the Cheikh Anta Diop lecturer. I don't know if they have anything in stock to confer a distinguished award to you, but in many ways, one can say that this also reflects your life story. Your father, before you, together with the likes of Walter Sisulu and Nelson Mandela, dedicated their lives to the struggle for the liberation of our continent. In this specific case, the liberation of South Africa from the apartheid system that had come to overwhelm the country and much of Southern Africa. You went into the liberation struggle at the age of 14. At the age of 14, and subsequently took military training in the Soviet Union, returned to Zambia to join the ANC, and in many ways the ANC has been your life and your life story ever since. In the period after the end of apartheid, you became the first deputy president of an independent South Africa, and after Mandela's first term and only term in office, you were elevated justifiably to the position of President of the Republic, a position which you resigned following some of the dramatic events that took place in Polokwane, where as head of the ANC, you did not return to that position. And when asked by the executive committee of the ANC to step down from the office of state president, you actually accepted. Shock, because actually constitutionally there was nothing that said you needed to step down from the office of president. but I think it also underscored the life of principle and discipline and respect for organizational policy and direction that you have exemplified all through your experience. And I think for this, many were grateful to you that in many ways you averted what could have been perhaps one of the biggest political constitutional crises in post-apartheid South Africa. Graciously stepped aside, made perhaps one of the most powerful speeches of your entire political career to the people of South Africa as you bade them goodbye. But you have remained in active public life ever since, helping to found your own foundation, the Thabo Mbeki Foundation, which has also spawned the Thabo Mbeki Leadership Institute at UNISA. You have, of course, been given many awards around, around the continent. I think in my own native Nigeria, we often claim that you are one of our honorary citizens, having been a representative of the ANC in Nigeria for a period of time, and currently serving also as the Chancellor of the University of South Africa, for which... Okay, UNISA guys. I'm warning you because Ahmadu Bello University were a bit outnumbered here. I just want to remind you that Ahmadu Bello University was the first. And the president can attest to the works of the Zaria School that Ahmadu Bello represented. I think one of your ongoing projects, which is the Presidential Library Project, is perhaps one which is not popularly known yet amongst many in this audience, but which hopefully when it is completed will represent perhaps one of the best legacies that you would be leaving for the continent of Africa, summarizing not only your own journey, but also the entire story of liberation of our continent. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I present to you President Thabo Mbeki.
Thanks a lot, Bayo. This table of mine is very small. Is this thing required here? No. No, thanks a lot, Bayo, for that very generous introduction. Our executive secretary, when he spoke just now, he said something that was incorrect. He said I was going to deliver a lecture. That's not true. He's been insisting on this thing for days and days. We are dealing with this topic around Africa and the crisis of globalization. And I think that, in a sense, that requires that we start off with some understanding of what we mean by globalization. Used in the context of this assembly. So let me start with a quotation from a famous German philosopher, economist, and all sorts of things. And he said the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement, and entombment in mines of the Aboriginal population, the beginning of the conquest and looting of the East Indies, the turning of Africa into a warren for the commercial hunting of black skins, signaling the rosy dawn of the era of capitalist production. And these idyllic proceedings are the chief momenta of primitive accumulation. And on their heels treads the commercial war of the European nations with the globe for a theater. It begins with the revolt of the Netherlands from Spain, assumes giant dimensions in England's anti-Jacobin War, and is still going on in the Opium Wars against China. And it's as the different momenta of primitive accumulation distribute themselves now more or less in chronological order, particularly over Spain, Portugal, Holland, France, and England. And in England, at the end of the 17th century, they arrive at a systematical combination embracing the colonies, the national debt, the modern mode of taxation, and the protectionist system. And these methods depend in part on brute force, the colonial system. But they all employ the power of the state, the concentrated and organized force of society to hasten, hothouse fashion, the process of transformation of the feudal mode of production into the capitalist mode, and to shorten the transition. And force is the midwife of every old society, pregnant with a new one. It is itself an economic power. And later says the bourgeoisie, by the rapid improvement of all instruments of production, by the immensely facilitated means of production, draws all, even the most backward nations, into civilization. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois mode of production. It compels them to introduce what they call civilization into their midst. That is, to become bourgeois themselves. In one word, it creates a world in its own image. Of course, being very educated people, I know we know I've been quoting Karl Marx. And is describing what is the principle, what is the first motive force which results in what has come to be called globalization, which is capital moving across boundaries to transform the whole world, the globe, into one market, which then becomes that globalization. And a group of African scholars and others have written that globalization of the economy includes the internationalization of trade, capital investment, finance, business, and the technology of production. And the dynamics of globalization occur not only in the economic sphere, but also tangible and perceptible in the areas of communications and transportation. And they say it is easy to observe and quantify the vast flow of capital, goods, and services around the world as in observing the distribution of images and ideas across national borders through antenna dishes and television sets. And I think Jomo yesterday, Sundaram, very adequately described the impact of that process of globalization, which is a transformation of the whole world into one market by dominant capital. He described the impact of that process of globalization on Africa. And I think very adequately, very correctly. So it should not be necessary for me to repeat that. There is, you know that Fidel Castro, the late Fidel, was a very eloquent person. He knew how to describe things. And he talked about this particular matter of the matter that Jomo was discussing. And described this process of globalization as people who are traveling in one boat, but in different classes of the boat. And some were traveling in first class, and therefore could enjoy all sorts of luxuries. And others were some traveling in that where the masses are. And he said that is the impact of globalization. It discriminates, again I'm saying in the manner that Jomo spoke about yesterday. Now part of the challenge I think we're faced as Africans with regard to this matter is that neoliberal thinking on matters of this kind has said that this process of globalization is a natural process of the development of capitalism. In a sense, it enjoys the force of nature. It's you can't do anything about it. It happens. You can't say, please stop the world, I want to come off, because the world won't stop. So we have no choice. No choice but to get on board this boat of globalization and see how best you can adapt. It's the same notion about that neoliberalism takes towards the capitalist system as such, and therefore even would then argue about these things about free markets, about liberalization, about small states, don't interfere. What elsewhere has been called market fundamentalism. But the fact of the matter is that it's not possible. It's not possible for us as Africans who experience that negative impact of globalization, as was described by Jomo yesterday, to stand aside and do nothing because neoliberal philosophy says do nothing. So I want to say a few words about these international responses. Our responses to this process of globalization, which relates to the rest of the world, necessary responses. I will not talk about what we might want to do domestically within the continent about this. I'm talking about the relations between Africa and the rest of the world. Let me start off by telling you a story. We, at the beginning of in 2001, the OAU adopted NEPAD, agreed on NEPAD. We then engaged the G8. The G8 and said to them, here we are. The OAU has adopted NEPAD. This is Africa's vision about its own development. And we want you, G8 countries, to refashion, to remodel your relations with the African continent based on this development program that the Africans themselves have elaborated. So the EU agreed. In 2002, the G8, and so did I say EU? I meant G8. The G8 met in Canada and adopted what they called the G8 Africa Action Plan. If members of CODESRIA are interested, I'm sure you can find it even on the internet. Very interesting. is a very detailed response of the G8 to NEPAD in terms of what they, the G8, would do. In addition to that, we set up a joint institution, a committee representing us, the Africans, and the G8, to oversee the implementation of the G8 Africa Action Plan. And based on what was described as a process of mutual accountability. And part of what we insisted on with regard to that was that the people who would represent the G8 in that committee should be people senior enough in their own countries to have access to the high levels of government. Those of us who are old enough here, like Mahmoud Mamdani, would remember people like Michel Kamdesu. Michel Kamdesu was at some point administrator of the IMF. He was a member of that committee. I'm mentioning him because it was then said these are the people who would have immediate access, for instance, in his case, to Jacques Chirac. So it was that kind of institution which was intended to make sure that the G8 Africa Action Plan is implemented and that we cooperate. That was an intervention in the globalization process to say, with regard to the impact of that globalization process on Africa, we as Africans are saying the following in the context of NEPAD, and therefore we would want you, the G8, to support the approach that the continent was taking. Therefore, of refusing to accede to this neoliberal approach, which was saying the globalization process is, in a sense, irreversible and, in a sense, untouchable. The G8 summit, that was 2002. The G8 summit went to back to Canada in 2010. And it had, the G8 Africa Action Plan had disappeared by then. It ceased to exist. So all of this vision that we had, that we could engage these developed countries to interact with the continent on the basis defined by the continent. I'm saying in 2002 they agreed, by 2010 they had forgotten. And it was a very interesting process because what happened was that because of this arrangement with the G8, there was always an African delegation which attended the G8 summits every year. And I think that process is still continuing to this day. And what used to happen is that as the G8 shifts from capital to capital, or country to country, each country would then choose what element of the G8 Africa Action Plan to emphasize. So I think when it went to the UK, they chose the matter about debt, the forgiving the African debt. That was the focus of the G8 when it met in England, in the UK. I think when it met in France, it was to focus on the question of water. When it went to Italy, I think it was it focused on the matter of child and maternal health. What we didn't realize was that what they were doing was to whittle away the action plan by presenting particular issues out of the action plan every year. But I'm saying that by the time the G8 went back to Canada in 2010, the G8 Africa Action Plan was not even on the agenda. And when our delegation tried to put it on the agenda, they failed. They couldn't get an agreement. It ceased to exist. I think also the Assembly will remember that the last round in terms of the WTO negotiations, the last round that should have been completed through the WTO was called the Doha Development Round. The Doha Development Round, as you know, collapsed. It's never completed. And principally collapsed because the EU and the United States basically refused to remove subsidies on agricultural products. And again, you remember that the Doha Development Round was called the Doha Development Round because it was focused on helping the developing countries. And one of the propositions was that the developing countries had this comparative advantage with regard to agricultural products. And in fact, if the developed world, the EU and the Americans, removed the subsidies on agricultural products, obviously, that would open up enormous, huge markets for the Africans and other developing countries to develop their agriculture to export to these countries. But the Doha Development Round collapsed essentially because these countries refused to remove those subsidies on agricultural products. So here were two attempts to intervene in the system of globalization to address the imbalances that Jomo was talking about yesterday. Both of them failed. We are about to, the negotiations have just started to negotiate a new agreement between the African, Pacific, Caribbean countries with the EU, because the current Cotonou agreement runs out in 2020. So the process has begun to negotiate a new post-Cotonou agreement. Now, just before the negotiation of the Cotonou agreement, there was a meeting of the ACP countries in Libreville, in Gabon. And in that conference, the EU Commissioner for Development made what was, for some of us, a bit of a puzzling statement. He said that we have to negotiate a new agreement post-Lome, but that new agreement must recognize that we are in a post-colonial period. And then he explained this by saying, you see, in terms of the Lome agreement, we've given you people access, duty-free access to our markets for so many things and done so many lovely things for you. This is Portuguese. Man was the Portuguese commissioner for development of the EU, as whatever it was called at the time. And he said, we had all of these lovely concessions which we gave you because we're feeling guilty. We're feeling guilty that we had colonized you. And now that guilt is gone. So when he says post-colonial, Cotonou must be based on this notion of a post-colonial period. He meant that. No more guilt on their part, and therefore no more concessions. And that became clear what they meant, because then we, all of us, everybody, the ACP countries, negotiated the Cotonou Agreement, and it included the economic partnership agreements. Then it became very clear what the professor from Portugal had meant by post-colonial period, because indeed the EPAs are based on the notion of reciprocity. That rather than us, the developed countries, giving you all of these concessions because we're feeling guilty, we must now, in this post-colonial period, base the relationship on reciprocity. True, phased in that reciprocal relationship, but I think all of us in the room are perfectly familiar with the problem that this has caused. Many countries on the continent have refused to sign the EPAs. Many countries have had to sign. Once I had to talk to one of the presidents here in West Africa who had intended to sign, but another country on the continent in West Africa, he had asked me, they said, can you please talk to him not to sign? So I said, all right, I'll do that, which I did. And this one I was talking to said, yes, indeed, we're going to sign, but because we understand everybody in the region is signing, I said, no, not everybody is signing. That's not correct. Okay, if you say so, I won't sign. And then he added, so long as the stomach allows me not to sign. So of course I had to get an explanation what this meant. And he said to me, you see, you know what happens. What the EU will do, I won't sign, as you have said, but what they will do, they will pick on one of the products which we're exporting to the EU and impose tariffs. And I'll have to succumb. He says, that's what I mean. So I said to him, I understand. Now, that what I'm saying, as we're progressing to the Cotonou agreements, we're told by the EU that we had to do an agreement which should be based on this post-colonial notion, which produced Cotonou and the EPAs. Now let me say something, just read something here. Some of the arguments against the EPAs, that these trade agreements may not automatically lead to more trade, and indeed that during the 40 years that the ACP countries have had preferential access to the European market, exports from these regions to the EU actually declined. And that despite the bridging period, the ACP countries fear that the EU exporters will get preferential access to their markets too quickly, therefore harming local producers. That the EPAs make it harder for the ACP countries to protect their infant industries by increasing competition in the market for their specialized products. That the EPAs may have a lock-in effect on ACP countries. And given increased regional integration, they may be bound to the region with which an EPA has been negotiated. And they said the main basis of EPA is quota-free and duty-free access to the EU single market may fade quickly due to competition from other non-ACP states concluding free trade agreements with the EU. At that time, when this process of the beginning of the process of this negotiation of EPAs, from a member of the European Parliament, who had been in charge of the Parliamentary Trade Committee of the European Parliament, said outside of the Director General for Trade, it has been impossible to find anyone with a good word to say for the EPAs. I'm saying that's a practical reality. The experience we've had with the EPAs coming out of the Cotonou Agreement. We are now going for a post-Cotonou agreement. What we are going to do with regard to that, I don't know. Because, of course, as you know, for us, the African countries, Caribbean, Pacific, that relationship with the EU is very important in terms of the economic development of our countries. It's another intervention with regard to this globalization process, which we need to make, but it needs to be a correct intervention in order to address the negatives, which Jomo spoke about yesterday. Now let me say something, read you something that comes from the AU. Talking about these forthcoming negotiations. And it says the declaration of the 5th African Union, European Union Summit called for a paradigm shift to an even stronger, this was a summit in Abidjan, it called for a paradigm shift to an even stronger, mutually beneficial partnership in the spirit of shared ownership, responsibility, reciprocity, respect, and mutual accountability and transparency. And said this paradigm shift should inform a new partnership that supports Africa's efforts to consolidate its own acquis from regional integration and make decisions pertaining to its own affairs, rather than leaving such decisions to other structures that are not under the continent's full control. The objective is to help in building peaceful, stable, well-directed, prosperous and resilient states and societies in accordance with the visions of both the unions, EU and AU, and to work together in synergy to advance common interests on the international political scene. Accordingly, in the new partnership, success is not measured in terms of euros received in aid, but rather through how the EU's involvement in Africa helps the continent to achieve its own established targets under Agenda 2063. So the AU is visualizing an agreement post-Cotonou, an agreement with the EU, informed by these sentiments. Mutual assistance, all this, and the Europeans are going to come and help us to break the chains. I don't quite know what the basis is for that judgment. Because I'm talking about the experience we had as Africa with regard to NEPAD, that we had with regard to Cotonou, that we had with regard to Doha, and those experiences are negative. And when the AU talks about something that is going to be under the control of the continent with regard to these forthcoming negotiations, is because there was a proposal that the ACP group should be broken up, so that the EU would then negotiate separate